which often meant destroying communities and building high-rise reservations for poor people. It was a time of federal programs like Model Cities and the Great Society, but it was also a time of intense community organizing. We recognized that while government programs and community organizations had identified what the problems were and had important roles to play in responding to those programs, their structure, philosophy, and resources made it impossible for them to make a lasting difference by themselves. As first-hand observers of the Great Society, we understood that fixing the problems of urban decay would require a different kind of approach. As bankers, we believed that the key to rebuilding disinvested and neglected neighborhoods was to harness the mechanisms of capitalism for a social purpose. In other words, decaying neighborhoods needed local, self-sustaining enterprises with the independence of a capital base and the discipline of a profit motive. Essentially, these enterprises would operate in the gap between private gain and public good. And we imagined a new kind of institution to support those enterprises, a local development bank, a bank that could be tough-minded about loans and about borrowers, but one that could also satisfy the most demanding federal examiners and still make a profit by transforming underserved urban neighborhoods. At the time that we began looking for a bank to buy, the owners of the then $40 million South Shore National Bank decided that it was time to sell and move the bank downtown. The reason they made that decision was during the preceding 4 or 5 years, the neighborhood had gone through an almost complete racial transformation, going from a 100% white neighborhood to about an 80% African American neighborhood. And during that time, the bank, because it had no capacity and no ability to respond to those changing racial demographics and the values and the work habits of people, often in a nuclear family holding down 3 jobs between 2 adults, the bank lost about half of its deposits. And there was an entire pattern throughout the United States in those days that when racial change took place in neighborhoods, the banks that were there would appeal to the regulators. They would use euphemisms and talk about change in the economic condition of their neighborhoods, but they really meant racial change. And up until 1972, when the control of the currency ruled against the South Shore National Bank, to the best of our knowledge, no bank in the United States had ever been denied permission to relocate under those circumstances. Now, we were looking for a bank to buy, okay, and we knew the story, and we knew that that permission had always been granted. Unfortunately, there were 3 people in the South Shore neighborhood who were, as I like to say, were not as smart as we were, and they decided to fight. And after 2 public hearings in December of 1972, they won. Okay? And the controller of the currency, who regulates all national banks, said that the bank had failed to show persuasive reason for abandoning its service area. It's the language of the order. And it was 9 months later, on August 23, 1973, with a princely $800,000 in capital and a $2.25 million floating rate loan, we bought this failing bank. Our goal was nothing less than to prove our theory, and that is to demonstrate that a bank could do well by also doing right. We created ShoreBank to explore and demonstrate the ways in which private capital and the nation's banking system can be used to achieve social purposes. It is by necessity a long-term proposition to invest in the residents, but they really are the only ones who can build sustainable communities. As the new managers of South Shore Bank, our goal was to restore the South Shore community competitiveness by rebuilding the market forces that disinvestment had destroyed. Our approach focused heavily on maintaining, retaining, and rebuilding the built environment by and for the people who live there. We started lending to people who wanted to renovate the buildings that were in that neighborhood. We found the local entrepreneurial energy in the craftsmen who bought, renovated, rented, and managed first a 6-flat and then a 12-unit building and then a 24-unit building, until what for them had been a sideline became a business, and what had been a community at risk became a stable community owned by its residents. Since then, for over 30 years, ShoreBank has demonstrated that local hands-on rehabbers can successfully buy, renovate, and rent the small multifamily buildings that predominate in most neighborhoods on Chicago's south and west sides. Buying, fixing up, and renting these buildings is a true entrepreneurial venture that requires appropriately structured financial products and skilled staff to provide them. I'm probably a little biased, but in this business segment, ShoreBank's record is unsurpassed. It restored normally functioning investor real estate markets in many of its priority communities through this lending. We now operate in Chicago in about 1/3 of the city, most of the south side, and a good portion of the west side. ShoreBank now has financed the purchase and rehabilitation of more than 55,000 units of affordable, unsubsidized housing at a rate of 3,000 to 5,000 units per year. Now, banks and mortgage companies provide most of the housing lending in the United States. However, they typically avoid the small apartment building sector. In a paper prepared a couple of years ago for the Millennial Housing Commission, the Housing Finance Task Force noted, and I quote, that financing for small multifamily properties, those of less than 50 units, is one of the most significant gaps in the mortgage industry. In some large cities, including Chicago, high concentrations of 5 to 50 unit apartment buildings coincide with low and moderate income neighborhoods, meaning that lower income renters and communities bear the brunt of the capital market gap.